Hello chess fans. Today we're going to be continuing our series on the Caro-Kann defense, and we will be talking about the open Caro-Kann, or also known as the classical Caro-Kann. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. So after e4, c6, d4, d5, in this position white plays this move knight to c3. This move doesn't have to be played. White can also play this move knight d2, but it transposes in this case. After you capture, we get the exact same positions because the knight recaptures and we go into the same lines. So here, after captures, there are three main continuations in this position. There's bishop to f5, which is the classical line. There's a knight f6, which goes into the Tartakower or Bronstein-Larsen variation, and we will talk about those. And there's also knight d7 in this position, which is called the Karpov variation. So I will start with bishop to f5, which is the classical line, getting the bishop out. Typical Caro-Kann idea. We want to develop the bishop and then play e6. So we want to get the bishop outside of the pawn chain so it's not stuck on c8. So after bishop to f5, white plays knight to g3, and we drop the bishop back to g6. And here, there are two moves, but they kind of transpose into one another. So knight to f3 is the move order that I have in this position, and the correct move to play against this knight f3 is knight to d7. The reason why we want to go knight d7 is because we want to control knight e5. And if white starts with h4, in this case we won't go knight d7, we will start with h6, because if we go knight d7 here, white will play h5, our bishop is trapped and we are losing the game. So knight f3, knight d7, h4, h6 is what we should play. If white starts with h4, you go h6. If white starts with knight f3, you go knight d7 first. Now, why do we play knight d7 and not e6, for example? That's because, as I said, we want to control e5 square, because in this position white can already jump into the e5 square and attack our bishop, and we have to move it, because if we allow white to take this, our structure is damaged. Our pawns will be split, and this is not what we want to do. So we drop the bishop back to h7, and here there are many lines that white can employ. For example, there's this queen h5 idea, and all of these positions are sort of equal, maybe slightly better for white if black knows what he's doing. However, I think it's best just to avoid all of these altogether and play knight d7 instead of e6 in this position. And now you have no problems, basically. So white plays h5, taking more space. We drop back to h7, bishop d3, we capture, queen captures, and now we play e6. Bishop to d2 is the main line. Bishop f4 can also be played. However, after knight f6 and then knight to d5, let me just show you. After a move like knight f6, this bishop can be a target in a lot of lines. When knight d5 is played, we hit the bishop. So our opponent wants to avoid that, so he puts the bishop on d2 instead. And after knight f6 castles, bishop e7. Notice we're putting the bishop on e7 and not on d6. And this will become clear in a moment. So after bishop e7, white has this move knight e4, because white has to do something. There are not a lot of good alternatives, like white can play king b1, for example, or white can try to play rook h3. In that case, you will start pushing your pawns on this side of the board. But white wants to move the g knight, so white can play g4 and start an attack on the king side. And after captures, knight f6, queen to e2, we play this move queen d5. And if the bishop was on d6, we would not be able to play queen d5, because the bishop would be blocking the way of the queen. So that's why we want to put the bishop on e7 and not on d6. Here we play queen d5, white plays c4, queen e4, and here is where my analysis ends. and here basically you're going into a queen trade line, and once the queens are exchanged, let's say takes, this is already equal. Black has successfully equalized the game. This pawn is under attack, so white has to defend it. And in my opinion, the position is very pleasant for both sides, but I like black a little bit more in these positions. But it is definitely equal, and it is definitely playable on both sides. Okay, now let's move on to the next variation, which is the Karpov variation. As I said, in this position, after, let me just go all the way back, after e4, c6, d4, d5, knight c3, takes. Here we discussed bishop f5 just now. I will discuss knight d7, which is the Karpov variation. I will discuss this one first before I discuss knight f6, because there are other lines in knight f6 that are very similar to like two knights Caro-Kann, and I want to talk about those together. So I will start with this just so I can get rid of it, and then I will talk about the other line. So knight d7, what's the idea here? The idea is that we want to play knight f6 and recapture with the knight. That's the idea. Now, if white plays any move other than a queen e2 or something, like let's say if white plays a very natural move, which is knight to f3, we simply continue with knight f6, and if white captures, we capture. We have a very pleasant position here. We will either go bishop g4 or bishop f5, and this is a very normal position. This is what we want. However, there are some tricks here that white can employ. For example, there's a move queen e2. This is a very well-known trap, and you cannot play knight to f6 here because you get checkmated, which is very unfortunate because there's a pin. The pawn cannot capture the knight. Wait, let me get rid of the arrows. The pawn cannot capture the knight because the king would be under attack. So in this case, after queen e2, you can continue with e6, and even though you're keeping this bishop locked, it's okay. It's not an issue here. However, you can also move this knight to f6. That's the move I was looking for there. This knight to f6, and here, of course, the queen is controlling d6, so there is no checkmate, and this is also a playable line. Okay, let me go back. There's another move in this position which you have to know, and that move is knight to g5. And this is a super tricky move because it basically pressures f7 and pressures all the squares here. And the move that I recommend in this position is actually h6. And if white captures on f7, then you're up a piece. This is not a sound sacrifice. If you play like this, you will most likely lose as white because you just continue developing with black, and it's totally fine. However, there's a move here which is very tricky, and that move is knight to e6. And this move, well, the knight is untakeable, first of all. If we take the knight, we get checkmated in 2 moves. This is very unfortunate. The game just ends here. However, this is not a very complicated move to deal with. We just move the queen to b6, normal response. And after white captures on f8, because white doesn't really have a better alternative, we capture with the knight. Knight f3, we continue developing, bishop d3, and here we have a super cool move, bishop to f5. So we have this bishop to f5 move, and if white captures on f5, queen a5 picks up the bishop again, and we are able to trade off our bad bishop on c8. So knight f6, bishop d3, bishop f5, and after castles we traded rook d8, c4, knight e6, bishop e3, queen a6, and white is maybe slightly better here, but the position remains in the balance regardless. Maybe it's like plus 0.4, but it is definitely playable for both sides. Okay, so that is the Karpov variation of the Caro-Kann. Now I'm going to move on to the next one, which is the knight f6 line, and after knight takes f6, here we have two ways to capture. I will begin with this one. So this is not as good at the computer level, the g takes f6. This is called the Bronstein-Larsen variation. However, it is playable, and if you watch Gotham Chess, if you watch his streams, he likes to play this as well, if I'm not mistaken, and it is playable. Although it's +1 or something like that if white plays perfectly. If white doesn't play perfectly, then of course black can equalize. So the best move here by white is this move, in my opinion, c3. The reason why c3 is the best move is because you're not forcing the issue. You're staying flexible, because if you play knight f3, you know you're gonna get pinged on g4, and you want to start with c3. So black has to develop this bishop to f5, and now you can play knight to f3, and after a move like knight d7, g3, e6, normal developing moves here. I'd say bishop d6, which is not the most accurate move, but it is the move that masters play most in this position. Bishop d6, castles, bishop g6. We get into a position like this where white is better. However, it's not entirely clear how white is better, and white still has to be very precise. Like, for example, white has to go for a4 and then this maneuver of knight d2, knight c4 in order to maintain the advantage. The knight is very strong on c4. So with perfect play, this position is going to be slightly better for white. However, it is still playable, and white has to find all of these moves in order to actually keep the game in his advantage. If not, then you will continue developing, and if your opponent plays moves like let's say bishop to d3 and moves like this, you will be able to capture this bishop, and then you will be able to just keep going with queen c7, queenside castles. Queen c7 is not the best move, by the way. The computer right now is telling me knight e5 is okay. This is unnatural, obviously, but queen c7 is one of the moves. Once you play queen c7, you can go queenside castle and then start an attack on the g file. So that is the idea. Okay. So that's the Bronstein-Larsen variation, and now let me move on to the Tartakower variation. I think this is probably the most popular variation at lower levels because it's quite safe. After takes, knight f6, captures, and we get into this position. Now, I want you to look at the structure that is in this position. We have the double f pawns, which make our king much safer once we castle. However, they're doubled, so in the long run, they're going to be weak. And I will open up a new position briefly just to show you how bad this could get in an endgame for black if you're not careful. So this is the position. You should be able to see it on the screen right now. This is the Tartakower structure, right? And now let me just show you why these doubled pawns are so weak. So let me just quickly bring the kings into the game. These moves might not necessarily be the best moves in the position. However, I just want to show, let me just start with f5. I just want to show the ideas here. So just push these pawns. And the idea is that what white will do is basically white will be able to put the pawns on h3 and f3 like this in like a bowl shape, like upside down bowl or a helmet, whatever this is. And this structure here is basically unbreakable. You cannot break through this structure because if you push the pawn here, white doesn't have to take. If white takes, then you have some breakthroughs. However, white can just simply move back and forth, and here you can take or you can push, and it doesn't matter. There is no breakthrough, and your extra f-pawn is nullified. If your extra f pawn is nullified, then that basically means that white is up a pawn. So white has an extra d pawn in this case. Not technically, but that's what it feels like according to the position. And basically, this pawn, it doesn't exist. Like, it doesn't matter if this pawn is on f5 or not. Okay, so that's what I wanted to show you. So now that we have established that, let's go back to this position right here and talk about discuss how to play this position. The best way to set up this position for white is to play, well, c3 first of all, bishop d3, and then put the knight on e2 and not on f3. There are two reasons why we put the knight on e2 and not on f3. Reason number one is we don't want to get pinned. That's reason number one. Secondly, there's another reason. This knight on e2 is controlling f4. So in a couple of moves, the bishop will go to f4 and the knight will be able to recapture. That's, of course, after castles and all that. You have to be careful. You can't go after rook e8. You can go bishop f4, obviously, because there's a pin. Like bishop f4, you would lose the bishop. However, in a couple of moves, this is what white wants. White wants to trade pieces off and get into an endgame. And what you want to do is instead of that, you want to keep the pieces on the board, and you want to remaneuver the knight to f8. So knight d7, knight f8. And play this structure. You want to bring the king up to g7 in a lot of positions, play h5, h4, and you can use these pawns as a shield and also a sword. So these pawns protect you. However, you can also just push them and start an attack, the same side attack, which is pretty cool in my opinion. That is why this structure is super flexible, super solid. However, you don't want to get into an endgame, so make sure to not trade pieces off when you get into this position. And let me just quickly continue how this line would go with ideal play. b6 takes, and we get into this position, which is equal. Okay, so that is the Tartakower variation. Now I want to talk about the two knights variation. So let me open up the two knights variation here. Wait, this is not the, no, this is the wrong one. Sorry about that. I think my thing is lagging. Give me a second. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I clicked the chapter, but it still opened up a different chapter. Like I clicked the two knights chapter, but it opened up the advanced variation. Anyways, let's continue. So here, this is the two knights variation after knight c3, d5, knight f3. Two knights attack. We capture here, white captures, and then we play knight to f6. Here, white has two options. White can play queen e2, or white can capture on f6. Now, capturing on f6 is not that great in my opinion, because now we are playing the Tartakower again, because it's the same structure as the Tartakower. However, the knight is already developed to f3, so white doesn't have the option of playing bishop d3, knight e2, which is the best setup for white. So in this case, after bishop d3, castles, we can play bishop to g4 and use this pin, which is quite strong. So we get a better version of the Tartakower in this case, a slightly better version, but the themes and the ideas are, relatively the same. Knight d7, knight to f8, and we are playing this position. Okay, there's a line here as well. After knight f6, instead of capturing the knight on f6, the main move is actually queen to e2. And after queen e2, we can capture the knight on e4, queen takes, and we can play queen to d5, which is offering a queen trade. And here there are many ways white can continue playing. For example, white can trade the queens, which is good for us. If we get into an end game, we have already equalized, so that is totally fine. White can also try to avoid the queen trade by moving the queen to either f4 or h4, but white can also try to play d3, which is, it looks weird, but one of my opponents actually played this, and then we get into this position, which actually looks like the end game offer variation of the Caro-Kann, which we will discuss in a separate video, but it's what it looks like, and we will discuss the intricacies of this structure in a separate video. However, this is another option that white has, and I wanted to show it to you anyways. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. Have a great day.